16 years ago, on March 18, 2009, Claudia Lawrence finished her evening shift at the university cafeteria and walked home through the familiar streets of her college town, never to be seen again. Her disappearance plunged her family into unimaginable tragedy and sent shockwaves through a tight-knit community that prided itself on safety and neighborly trust. The police initially considered routine possibilities. Perhaps she had left voluntarily, maybe an accident had occurred. But as hours turned to days without any trace, the case took on a more sinister tone. Claudia's father, Peter Lawrence, refused to accept the growing silence from authorities, fighting tirelessly to keep his daughter's case alive even as official interest began to wane. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Here, we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The evening of March 17th had been unremarkable in every way that would later seem devastatingly significant. Claudia, a 35-year-old chef known for her reliability and warm personality, had completed her duties at the university's main dining hall with her usual efficiency. Colleagues remembered her laughing with co-workers, discussing weekend plans, and mentioning her excitement about spring arriving early that year. She had worked at the university for nearly 6 years, building a reputation as someone who never missed a shift and always stayed late to help struggling students or overworked staff. Security footage from the campus showed Claudia leaving the dining hall at approximately 6:45 p.m., her chef's coat folded neatly under her arm, car keys already in hand. She walked with the confident stride of someone following a routine performed hundreds of times before. The parking lot cameras captured her, unlocking her modest sedan and driving toward the residential area where she had lived alone for the past 3 years. Traffic cameras along her usual route home confirmed she'd made all the typical stops. A brief pause at the grocery store, a quick visit to the gas station where she was a regular customer. Store clerk Marcus Webb would later tell investigators that Claudia seemed perfectly normal during their brief interaction. She had purchased her usual items, a bottle of wine, ingredients for what appeared to be a simple dinner, and a magazine she had been following. "She asked about my daughter's college applications," Webb recalled months later, his voice heavy with the weight of being among the last people to speak with Claudia. "She was always interested in other people's lives, always encouraging. That's why this whole thing makes no sense." The drive from the gas station to Claudia's rented house on Maple Street should have taken exactly 12 minutes. Her landlord, elderly Mrs. Patterson, lived in the main house and often noticed when Claudia arrived home from work. That evening, Mrs. Patterson had been watching television in her front room, positioned perfectly to observe the driveway. She had expected to see Claudia's headlights sweep across her curtains sometime before 7:30 p.m., as had happened countless times before. But the driveway remained dark, and the familiar sound of Claudia's car door never echoed through the quiet neighborhood. When Claudia failed to appear for her morning shift the next day, something that had never happened in her 6 years of employment, her supervisor, Janet Mills, immediately knew something was wrong. Claudia would call if she was going to be 5 minutes late, Mills explained to the first responding officers. She had never, not once, failed to show up or call. She took her job seriously, took pride in feeding people, in being dependable. Mills had tried calling Claudia's cell phone repeatedly throughout the morning, each call going straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring amplifying her growing concern. The university's Human Resources Department initially suggested that perhaps Claudia had experienced a family emergency or sudden illness, but a quick check with her listed emergency contacts revealed that no one had heard from her. Her father, Peter Lawrence, received the call that would change his life forever just before noon on March 19th. "At first, I thought maybe she had food poisoning or something minor," Peter would later recount. Claudia was healthy, responsible, careful. The idea that she could just disappear, it was impossible to process. By the time police arrived at Claudia's house on Maple Street, nearly 18 hours had passed since she was last seen. The scene they encountered would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. Claudia's car was nowhere to be found, but all of her personal belongings remained untouched inside the house. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet intact with credit cards and cash. Her cell phone lay charging beside her bed, the screen dark and silent. Most significantly, there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that anything violent had occurred within the home's walls. The house told the story of someone who had expected to return. Claudia's work uniform for the next day hung pressed and ready in her bedroom closet. She had set out ingredients for breakfast on the kitchen counter: oatmeal, fresh berries, her favorite coffee blend. The television in the living room was still tuned to the news channel she watched each morning, the volume turned down low out of consideration for her elderly landlord. Everything suggested a woman who had every intention of waking up in her own bed and continuing her normal routine. Detective Sarah Morrison, the lead investigator assigned to Claudia's case, found herself facing a mystery that defied logical explanation. In 20 years of police work, I had never encountered a disappearance quite like this, Morrison reflected years later. We had no body, no crime scene, no witnesses to any kind of struggle or abduction. It was as if Claudia had simply evaporated between the gas station and her home. The 12-minute drive that should have been routine had somehow become the gateway to a mystery that would consume investigators, family members, and community volunteers for years to come. As news of Claudia's disappearance spread throughout the college town, a sense of unease settled over residents who had always believed their community was safe from the kind of violence and mystery that plagued larger cities. Parents began walking their college-aged children to classes, neighbors started double-checking their locks, and the local newspaper found itself covering its first missing person case in over a decade. The question that haunted everyone was devastatingly simple. How does someone disappear so completely in broad daylight, leaving behind a life that showed every sign of continuing exactly as it had for years? The first 48 hours following Claudia Lawrence's disappearance would prove crucial in shaping how her case unfolded, establishing patterns of frustration and missed opportunities that would plague the investigation for years to come. Detective Sarah Morrison and her team faced the immediate challenge of determining whether they were dealing with a voluntary disappearance, an accident, or something far more sinister. The absence of Claudia's vehicle complicated every theory, transforming what might have been a localized search into a multi-state investigation that stretched resources thin and opened countless possibilities for where she might have gone or been taken. The police department's initial approach reflected the statistical reality that most missing adults leave voluntarily, often due to personal crises, financial troubles, or relationship complications. Investigators began by examining Claudia's recent behavior, searching for signs of depression, debt, or romantic entanglements that might explain a sudden departure. They interviewed her co-workers extensively, seeking any indication that she had been planning to leave or had expressed dissatisfaction with her life. What they discovered instead was a portrait of a woman who seemed genuinely content with her circumstances, deeply rooted in her community and completely committed to her responsibilities. Janet Mills, Claudia's supervisor, provided investigators with detailed accounts of her employees' recent demeanor and performance. If anything, Claudia had seemed more upbeat than usual in the weeks before she disappeared, Mills explained during her formal interview. She had been talking about taking a vacation that summer, maybe visiting her cousin in California. She had asked me about the procedure for requesting extended time off, which isn't something you do if you're planning to disappear forever. Mills also noted that Claudia had recently received a small promotion and salary increase, further evidence that she was building a future rather than planning an escape. The financial investigation yielded similarly puzzling results. Claudia's bank accounts showed no unusual activity in the months preceding her disappearance. She had been steadily saving money, making regular payments on her student loans, and maintaining the same spending patterns she had established over years of careful budgeting. There were no large withdrawals, no mysterious deposits, no evidence of financial stress that might drive someone to desperate measures. Her credit cards had not been used since her last purchase at the gas station on March 17th, and her cell phone had been inactive since that same evening. Peter Lawrence arrived in town within hours of learning about his daughter's disappearance, immediately establishing himself as a driving force behind the search efforts. A retired engineer with a methodical mind and unwavering determination, Peter refused to accept the possibility that Claudia had chosen to vanish. "My daughter was not the type of person to walk away from her responsibilities," he stated firmly during press conferences that became increasingly frequent as days passed without answers. "She would never put her family through this kind of anguish voluntarily. Something happened to her, and I won't rest until we find out what." Peter's engineering background proved invaluable as he began conducting his own parallel investigation, meticulously documenting every lead, every interview, every piece of evidence that official investigators uncovered. He created detailed timelines, mapped potential routes Claudia might have taken, and maintained extensive files on every person who had known his daughter. His systematic approach would later reveal gaps in the police investigation and identify potential witnesses who had been overlooked during the initial canvass of the neighborhood. The search for Claudia's missing vehicle became a central focus of the investigation, with law enforcement agencies across multiple states receiving alerts to watch for her distinctive sedan. The car's absence was particularly frustrating because it represented the most tangible clue investigators had. Wherever Claudia was, her vehicle was likely nearby. Police organized searches of parking lots, wooded areas, and bodies of water within a 100-mile radius of her home, but weeks of intensive searching yielded no trace of the missing automobile. Community volunteers, many of them Claudia's co-workers and fellow church members, organized their own search efforts to supplement official police activities. They distributed flyers throughout the college town and surrounding areas, established a tip hotline, and created a social media presence that would eventually attract national attention to the case. The university where Claudia had worked provided meeting spaces for volunteer coordination and offered a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. Students who had known Claudia through the dining hall began wearing ribbons in her honor and organizing memorial services that reflected their hope for her eventual return. As the investigation entered its second month without significant breakthroughs, Detective Morrison found herself facing mounting pressure from the community, the media, and Claudia's increasingly frustrated family. The case had captured regional attention, with television news crews arriving to cover what local reporters were calling the vanishing of Maple Street. Morrison appreciated the publicity, hoping that widespread coverage might generate the crucial tip that would break the case open. But she also worried about the impact of intense scrutiny on her investigative process. The detectives' team had conducted over 200 interviews by the end of April, speaking with everyone from Claudia's closest friends to casual acquaintances, from regular customers at the gas station to students who barely remembered her face. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a woman who was well-liked but intensely private, someone who maintained friendly relationships without revealing deep personal details. Several interviewees mentioned that Claudia seemed to guard her personal life carefully, rarely discussing romantic relationships or family conflicts that might provide insight into her disappearance. One aspect of the investigation that particularly troubled Detective Morrison was the complete absence of digital forensic evidence. In an era when most people's lives were increasingly documented through cell phone communications, social media posts, and electronic transactions, Claudia's digital footprint had simply stopped at 6:45 p.m. on March 17th. Her last text message had been sent to a co-worker earlier that afternoon, confirming her schedule for the following day. Her social media accounts showed no activity after her disappearance, and her email remained unopened, despite receiving dozens of increasingly worried messages from friends and colleagues. The investigation also revealed several inconsistencies in witness accounts that would prove significant as the case developed. Different neighbors provided conflicting information about whether they had seen or heard anything unusual on the night Claudia disappeared. Some reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, while others insisted the evening had been completely quiet. These discrepancies weren't necessarily indicative of deception, but they highlighted how unreliable human memory could be, especially when people were trying to recall routine events that had seemed unimportant at the time. By summer's end, Detective Morrison faced the heartbreaking reality that her investigation was stalling despite extensive efforts and community support. The case file had grown to over 3,000 pages, containing witness statements, forensic reports, search documentation, and follow-up investigations that had all led to dead ends. The detective knew that statistical probabilities suggested Claudia was no longer alive, but without a body or crime scene, there was no way to definitively declare her case a homicide. The investigation would continue, but resources were being redirected to newer cases, and the intensive daily focus on finding Claudia was beginning to diminish. For her father and friends, this shift marked the beginning of a long, painful journey toward accepting that answers might never come. As autumn arrived, 6 months after Claudia Lawrence's disappearance, the investigation began revealing uncomfortable truths about the supposedly close-knit college community that had initially rallied around the missing woman's family. Detective Morrison's continued interviews were uncovering a network of personal relationships, hidden affairs, and long-kept secrets that painted a more complex picture of Claudia's life than anyone had initially suspected. The woman, who had seemed so transparent and straightforward to her co-workers and neighbors, had apparently maintained a private world that few people had been permitted to enter. The breakthrough that changed everything came through an unexpected source: Claudia's cell phone records, which took months to fully analyze due to technical complications with her service provider. When the complete records finally arrived, they revealed patterns of communication that contradicted the portrait of a simple, uncomplicated life that had emerged during early interviews. Claudia had been in regular contact with several men, including some who were married, and had initially denied knowing her well when questioned by police. The phone records showed late-night conversations, frequent text message exchanges, and a level of intimate communication that suggested relationships far more complex than casual friendship. Thomas Mitchell, a married professor at the university where Claudia worked, became a person of intense interest when phone records revealed that he had been in contact with Claudia almost daily in the weeks before her disappearance. Mitchell, who had initially told police he barely knew Claudia beyond ordering coffee from the cafeteria, was forced to admit under direct questioning that they had been involved in an ongoing affair for nearly 2 years. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the investigation and the university community, where Mitchell was well regarded as a family man and dedicated educator. During his subsequent interview, Mitchell broke down and confessed the full extent of his relationship with Claudia, describing a passionate but troubled affair that had been causing him increasing anxiety about his marriage and career. "Claudia had been pressuring me to leave my wife," Mitchell admitted to Detective Morrison, his hands shaking as he spoke. "She said she was tired of being a secret, tired of having to pretend we barely knew each other when we passed in the hallways. The last time we spoke, she told me she might do something that would force my hand, make it impossible for me to keep living a double life." This revelation opened entirely new avenues of investigation, but also raised disturbing questions about how many other aspects of Claudia's life had been misunderstood or deliberately concealed. If she had been involved in one serious affair that she had hidden from friends and family, what other relationships or conflicts might she have been concealing? Detective Morrison began re-interviewing witnesses with new questions, focusing on whether anyone had observed Claudia with men who hadn't been previously identified or mentioned during the initial investigation. The detectives' team also discovered that Claudia had maintained a post office box that she had never mentioned to anyone, including her landlord and closest friends. The box had been rented under her name for over a year before her disappearance, and postal records showed that she had been receiving mail there regularly. When investigators finally gained access to the box, they found it empty, but postal workers remembered Claudia coming in frequently to collect correspondence. The existence of the secret mailing address suggested a level of deliberate privacy that contradicted the open, straightforward personality that everyone had described. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Additional phone records revealed that Claudia had been in contact with a private investigator in the state capital, though the nature of their communication remained unclear. When Detective Morrison contacted the investigator David Chen, he initially claimed attorney-client privilege and refused to discuss his interactions with Claudia. Only after legal pressure and a court order did Chen reveal that Claudia had hired him to investigate her own past, specifically seeking information about her biological father, whom she had never known. This search had apparently uncovered information that had disturbed Claudia greatly, though Chen claimed she had ended their professional relationship before he could provide complete findings. The investigation into Claudia's family history revealed another layer of complexity that no one had previously suspected. According to Chen's files, Claudia had discovered that her biological father was still alive and living in the same general region where she had disappeared. More troubling, she had learned that he had a criminal history involving violence against women and had served time in prison for assault charges that were decades old. Claudia had apparently been torn between wanting to contact him and fearing what such a meeting might bring into her carefully constructed life. Peter Lawrence was devastated to learn that his daughter had been conducting such a search without confiding in him. "I raised Claudia from the time she was 2 years old," he told Detective Morrison, his voice breaking with emotion. "I was her father, in every way that mattered. I don't understand why she felt she needed to find this man, why she couldn't talk to me about these feelings. If I had known she was struggling with questions about her past, I would have helped her find answers safely." The revelation about Claudia's search for her biological father led investigators to examine whether this man might have been involved in her disappearance. Raymond Santos, the biological father, was located living in a neighboring state under an assumed name, working construction and apparently trying to maintain a low profile. When confronted by police, Santos initially denied any knowledge of Claudia's existence, but phone records proved that she had contacted him at least 3 times in the month before her disappearance. Their conversations, according to cell phone data, had lasted over an hour each time. Under pressure, Santos admitted that Claudia had reached out to him and that they had arranged to meet in person. He claimed that he had tried to discourage the meeting, warning her that he was not the kind of father she was probably hoping to find. "I told her I was trouble, that she was better off not knowing me," Santos explained during his police interview. "She wouldn't listen. She said she needed to understand where she came from, needed to see me face to face at least once. We arranged to meet at a restaurant halfway between where we both lived." According to Santos, the meeting had never taken place because Claudia had called him the day she disappeared to cancel, saying she had changed her mind and didn't want to pursue a relationship after all. He claimed that was the last time they had spoken and provided phone records that seemed to support his account. However, the timing of this alleged conversation corresponded exactly with the period when Claudia's phone had gone silent, raising questions about whether Santos was telling the complete truth about their final interaction. The discovery of these hidden aspects of Claudia's life transformed the investigation from a straightforward missing person case into a complex web of relationships, secrets, and potential motives that stretched across state lines. Detective Morrison found herself wondering how many other secrets might be waiting to be uncovered, and whether the woman who had disappeared was anything like the person her friends and family believed they knew. The case that had begun with a simple question, "Where is Claudia Lawrence?" had evolved into a much more troubling mystery. Who was Claudia Lawrence, and what had she been running toward or away from in the final weeks of her visible life? The first anniversary of Claudia Lawrence's disappearance arrived with a devastating combination of renewed media attention and crushing disappointment for her family, as investigators faced the reality that despite thousands of hours of work and hundreds of leads, they were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been in the initial weeks after she vanished. Detective Morrison had seen promising leads collapse under scrutiny, witnessed false confessions from attention seekers, and watched as forensic evidence that seemed significant turned out to be irrelevant. The case that had once seemed solvable through methodical investigation had become a labyrinth of possibilities that seemed to lead nowhere. Throughout the year, the tip hotline had received over 800 calls from people claiming to have seen Claudia in locations ranging from neighboring states to foreign countries. Each credible sighting required investigation, sending detectives on trips that consumed time and resources while ultimately proving fruitless. A gas station attendant in Ohio was certain he had sold cigarettes to Claudia 2 months after her disappearance, providing detailed descriptions that matched her appearance perfectly. Security footage from the station, however, showed a woman who bore only superficial resemblance to the missing chef, highlighting how desperately people wanted to help solve the case that they were seeing Claudia everywhere. The most painful false lead involved a woman's body discovered in a wooded area approximately 50 miles from Claudia's home. The remains were found by hunters in late November, nearly 8 months after the disappearance, and the physical characteristics initially seemed to match Claudia's description. Peter Lawrence endured 3 agonizing days, waiting for dental records to provide definitive identification, preparing himself emotionally for the confirmation that his daughter was dead, while simultaneously hoping against hope that the body belonged to someone else. When the forensic results finally excluded Claudia, Peter experienced a complex mixture of relief and renewed anguish, grateful that his daughter's fate remained unknown, but tortured by the continuation of uncertainty. The investigation had also been complicated by the emergence of multiple theories that captured public imagination, but led investigators down unproductive paths. Internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases generated elaborate conspiracy theories involving human trafficking networks, witness protection programs, and underground criminal organizations. While Detective Morrison appreciated public interest in the case, she found herself having to allocate valuable resources to investigate outlandish scenarios that had gained traction online. Each theory required careful examination because, in a case as puzzling as Claudia's, investigators couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility entirely. One particularly persistent theory suggested that Claudia had been targeted by a serial killer who might be responsible for other unsolved disappearances in the region. True crime enthusiasts had identified several cases involving women who had vanished under mysterious circumstances within a 300-mile radius over the previous decade. While Detective Morrison acknowledged the statistical possibility that a serial offender might be responsible, the evidence didn't support connections between the cases. Each disappearance had unique circumstances, different victim profiles, and varying levels of evidence that made it unlikely they were related. The strain of the ongoing investigation began taking its toll on everyone involved, but perhaps no one suffered more than Peter Lawrence, who had dedicated his retirement years to searching for his daughter. He had spent his life savings, hiring private investigators, traveling to follow up on leads, and maintaining pressure on law enforcement to keep the case active. Friends and family members watched helplessly as Peter's health deteriorated under the stress of his relentless search, his appearance aging years in the span of months as hope and despair battled for control of his daily existence. Peter's determination had led him to become something of an expert on missing person cases, and he had established relationships with families facing similar tragedies across the country. These connections provided emotional support, but also exposed him to the harsh reality that many families never receive answers about their missing loved ones. "I've met parents who have been searching for 20, 30 years, Peter confided to a local reporter during a candid interview. "I understand now that there are no guarantees, that wanting answers badly enough doesn't mean you'll get them. But I can't stop looking for Claudia. She would never stop looking for me." The university where Claudia had worked established a scholarship in her name, creating a permanent memorial that honored her dedication to serving others. The scholarship was funded through community donations and provided assistance to students studying culinary arts, reflecting Claudia's passion for her profession. While the gesture was meant to celebrate her life and contribution to the community, it also served as a daily reminder that she remained missing, that her story was unfinished, and that the questions surrounding her disappearance continued to haunt everyone who had known her. Detective Morrison found herself facing pressure from department administrators to reduce the resources dedicated to Claudia's case as newer investigations demanded attention. While she understood the practical necessities of resource allocation, Morrison struggled with the moral implications of scaling back efforts to find a woman who had simply vanished without explanation. The detective had developed a personal investment in solving the case that went beyond professional obligation, driven by her respect for Peter Lawrence's determination and her own frustration with the inexplicable nature of Claudia's disappearance. As the case entered its second year, Morrison began exploring cold case techniques and technologies that might provide new avenues for investigation. She consulted with FBI profilers who specialized in missing person cases, seeking fresh perspectives on the evidence that had been collected. The profilers suggested that Claudia's disappearance bore characteristics of both planned departure and involuntary abduction, making it particularly difficult to categorize and solve. They recommended focusing on the relationships Claudia had been concealing, particularly the affair with Professor Mitchell and her search for her biological father, as the most likely sources of answers. The anniversary of Claudia's disappearance brought renewed media coverage that generated fresh tips and leads, but also reminded the community of how little progress had been made despite intensive efforts. A television documentary crew arrived to film a retrospective piece about the case, interviewing family members, investigators, and community volunteers who had participated in search efforts. The documentary would eventually air nationally, bringing Claudia's story to a wider audience, but also highlighting the frustrating reality that some mysteries resist even the most dedicated investigative efforts. Peter Lawrence marked the anniversary by organizing a memorial service at the church, where Claudia had been a regular attendee, drawing hundreds of people who wanted to show their continued support for the family and demonstrate that the community had not forgotten their missing member. The service included prayers for Claudia's safe return, testimonials from friends and co-workers about her positive impact on their lives, and a renewed pledge from law enforcement to continue pursuing every possible lead. As participants left the church that evening, many were struck by the sobering realization that they might be gathering for similar anniversaries for years to come, that Claudia Lawrence had become part of their community's permanent collective memory, as an unsolved mystery rather than a person who had been found and brought home. 2 years after Claudia Lawrence's disappearance, the college town that had once united in support of finding her began experiencing fractures that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, community loyalty, and the limits of collective compassion. The initial wave of sympathy and volunteer enthusiasm had gradually given way to a more complex social dynamic, as some residents grew weary of the ongoing investigation while others remained steadfast in their commitment to keeping Claudia's case in the public eye. These divisions created tension that extended far beyond the missing person case itself, touching on class differences, town versus university politics, and fundamental disagreements about how long a community should maintain hope for someone who might never return. The revelation about Claudia's affair with Professor Thomas Mitchell had particularly divided public opinion, with some community members expressing shock and disappointment that their memories of her had been based on incomplete information. Conservative residents, particularly those affiliated with the church where Claudia had been a regular attendee, struggled to reconcile their perception of her as a moral, upstanding citizen with the evidence of her involvement in adultery. These residents didn't withdraw their support for finding her, but their enthusiasm was notably dampened by the discovery that she had been living a double life that violated their religious and social values. Conversely, other community members rallied to Claudia's defense, arguing that her personal relationships were irrelevant to the fact that she was missing and deserved to be found, regardless of moral judgments about her behavior. University faculty and staff, many of whom had more liberal social attitudes, organized counter-demonstrations when conservative groups suggested that resources might be better spent on more deserving missing persons. These ideological divisions created an uncomfortable atmosphere at community meetings, search organization gatherings, and even church services, where congregation members found themselves on opposing sides of debates about Claudia's character and worthiness. The Mitchell family became unwilling participants in the community drama, as Professor Mitchell's wife Sarah faced social ostracism from some quarters while receiving sympathy from others. Sarah Mitchell had initially stood by her husband when news of the affair became public, but the strain of constant scrutiny and whispered conversations had taken a severe toll on their marriage and family life. Their 2 teenage children endured harassment at school from classmates who repeated gossip they had overheard from their parents, creating a secondary layer of victims in Claudia's disappearance that complicated the community's response to the ongoing investigation. Peter Lawrence found himself navigating these social divisions while maintaining his focus on finding his daughter, often serving as a diplomatic bridge between factions that might otherwise have abandoned cooperation entirely. His dignity in the face of revelations about Claudia's private life earned him respect from across the political and social spectrum, but he privately struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion about the daughter he had thought he knew completely. "I raised her to be honest, to value integrity above all else," Peter confided to Detective Morrison during one of their regular meetings. "Learning about her secrets doesn't make me love her less, but it makes me question everything I thought I understood about who she was." The investigation itself had become a source of community division, as some residents criticized the police department for what they perceived as incompetence or lack of effort, while others defended law enforcement and blamed the complexity of the case for the lack of progress. Town hall meetings that had once focused on coordinating search efforts devolved into heated exchanges about police procedures, resource allocation, and whether outside investigators should be brought in to take over the case. These debates often split along familiar lines of town versus university residents, long-time locals versus newer arrivals, and those who had known Claudia personally versus those who knew her only by reputation. Detective Morrison found herself caught in the middle of these community tensions, trying to maintain professional objectivity while managing political pressure from multiple directions. The police chief faced criticism at city council meetings, with some members questioning whether the department was equipped to handle such a complex investigation, and others defending the thoroughness of the efforts being made. Morrison appreciated community interest in the case, but found that managing public expectations and political concerns was consuming time and energy that could have been devoted to actual investigative work. The university administration faced its own delicate balancing act, trying to support the investigation while protecting the institution's reputation and the privacy of employees who had become involved in the case. Professor Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave when his relationship with Claudia became public, but faculty unions argued that his personal life shouldn't affect his professional status unless criminal behavior was proven. Students organized both support rallies for finding Claudia and protest demonstrations against what they perceived as the university's inadequate response to the situation, creating campus tensions that interfered with the academic environment. Media coverage of the case had evolved from sympathetic reporting about a missing woman to more sensationalized stories focusing on the affair, family secrets, and community divisions. National news programs that had initially presented Claudia's disappearance as a straightforward missing person case began emphasizing the more scandalous aspects of her story, often portraying the small college town as a hotbed of hidden corruption and moral decay. Local residents resented this characterization of their community, leading to increased resistance to cooperating with journalists and camera crews who arrived seeking dramatic footage and salacious quotes. The economic impact of the ongoing investigation and media attention created another source of community division, as local businesses experienced both positive and negative effects from the national spotlight. Some establishments near the university benefited from increased traffic from visitors and journalists covering the story, while others found that the association with the mysterious disappearance was hurting their reputations and driving away customers. The tourism board faced the uncomfortable challenge of promoting the area's attractions while downplaying its connection to an unsolved criminal case, leading to marketing strategies that seemed to ignore the elephant in the room. Local churches experienced their own internal struggles over how to respond to the case, with some congregations offering unwavering support for the Lawrence family, while others engaged in theological debates about forgiveness, moral judgment, and the proper Christian response to adultery and deception. These religious discussions sometimes became heated, with long-time church members finding themselves on opposite sides of fundamental questions about grace, justice, and community responsibility. Several families left their congregations over disagreements about how the churches were handling the Claudia Lawrence situation, creating lasting divisions that extended well beyond the missing person case itself. As the second anniversary of Claudia's disappearance approached, community leaders recognized that the social fractures created by the case were becoming permanent features of the town's landscape. What had begun as a unified effort to find a missing community member had evolved into a complex web of competing interests, moral judgments, and political divisions that reflected deeper tensions about values, class, and belonging. The question of what had happened to Claudia Lawrence remained unanswered, but her disappearance had already transformed the community in ways that would likely persist long after her case was resolved, if it ever was resolved at all. 3 years after Claudia Lawrence vanished without a trace, a completely unexpected discovery would breathe new life into an investigation that many had assumed would never be solved. The breakthrough came not through traditional police work or community tips, but through the meticulous efforts of a retired FBI profiler named Marcus Webb, who had been following the case independently and applying advanced analytical techniques that local law enforcement lacked the resources to employ. Webb's findings would challenge every assumption investigators had made about Claudia's disappearance and introduce possibilities that no one had previously considered. Webb had become interested in Claudia's case through his work with the national database of unsolved disappearances, where he used pattern recognition software to identify connections between seemingly unrelated cases. His analysis revealed that Claudia's disappearance shared significant characteristics with 4 other cases involving women who had vanished under similar circumstances across 3 different states over a 7-year period. All 5 women had been between the ages of 30 and 40. All had worked in food service positions at educational institutions, and all had disappeared after leaving work in the early evening hours without their vehicles ever being recovered. The pattern that Webb identified was sophisticated and subtle, suggesting an offender who deliberately targeted victims with specific characteristics and operational vulnerabilities. The geographic distribution of the cases indicated someone who traveled extensively, possibly for work, and who had detailed knowledge of college town dynamics and security procedures. Most significantly, Webb's analysis suggested that the perpetrator had been escalating over time, with intervals between disappearances becoming shorter and risk-taking behavior becoming more pronounced. If this case has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps Claudia Lawrence's story reach more people. When Webb contacted Detective Morrison with his findings, she initially expressed skepticism about connecting Claudia's case to other disappearances based on general similarities. However, Webb's presentation included forensic details that had not been released to the public, information that he had obtained through his law enforcement network, and that perfectly matched evidence from Claudia's case. The most compelling connection involved trace evidence from Claudia's house that had seemed irrelevant at the time, but matched similar evidence found at the scenes of 2 other disappearances. The trace evidence consisted of microscopic paint chips that had been discovered on Claudia's porch railing, evidence so small that it had been overlooked during initial processing of the crime scene. Advanced laboratory analysis revealed that the paint came from a specific type of commercial vehicle, likely a delivery truck or utility van manufactured between 2005 and 2008. When similar paint chips were found at the other connected cases, the probability of coincidence became statistically negligible, suggesting that the same vehicle had been present at multiple crime scenes. Webb's investigation also revealed that a white utility van matching the paint profile had been reported in the vicinity of each disappearance, usually by witnesses who had noticed it because it seemed out of place in residential neighborhoods during evening hours. The van had different license plates in each location, suggesting the use of stolen or fraudulent registration, and appeared to be operated by someone who understood how to avoid security cameras and traffic monitoring systems. The sophistication of the operation implied an offender with experience in surveillance, law enforcement, or military training. The discovery of these connections prompted a major shift in investigative strategy as Detective Morrison coordinated with law enforcement agencies in other states to share information and resources. The cases were officially linked through a federal task force that included FBI specialists in serial crime and behavioral analysis. For the first time since Claudia's disappearance, investigators had a concrete direction for their efforts and a sense that they might be dealing with a criminal who could potentially be identified and apprehended. The behavioral profile that emerged from the linked cases painted a disturbing picture of a highly organized offender who selected victims based on specific criteria and invested significant time in surveillance and planning before striking. The perpetrator appeared to target women who lived alone, worked predictable schedules, and followed routine patterns that could be observed and exploited. The choice of college towns suggested someone who understood that transient populations and academic calendars could provide cover for extended surveillance activities without drawing attention. Peter Lawrence received the news about the potential connections with a mixture of hope and anguish, as the possibility of finding answers about his daughter's fate was tempered by the realization that she might have been the victim of a serial predator rather than someone who had voluntarily disappeared or been harmed by an acquaintance. Part of me is relieved to know that there might be an explanation for what happened to Claudia, Peter told reporters at a press conference announcing the new developments. But it's horrifying to think that she might have been targeted by someone who had done this to other families, other daughters. And the investigation's new direction required a complete re-examination of evidence from Claudia's case, with forensic specialists applying techniques that had not been available or considered necessary 3 years earlier. Advanced DNA analysis of trace evidence from her house revealed genetic material that did not match any known associates or suspects from the original investigation. The DNA appeared to belong to a male individual who had left microscopic traces on surfaces that suggested he had been inside Claudia's home, despite the absence of any signs of forced entry or struggle. Surveillance footage from the university and surrounding businesses was reanalyzed using facial recognition software and enhanced imaging techniques that revealed details previously invisible to human observers. The improved analysis identified a figure in the background of several images who appeared to be watching Claudia during her daily routines in the weeks before her disappearance. The individual was always partially obscured by shadows, vehicles, or other obstructions, suggesting deliberate attempts to avoid clear identification while maintaining visual contact with the target. The task force investigation also revealed that similar surveillance had been conducted on the other victims in the linked cases, with witnesses recalling seeing the same white van or suspicious individuals in their neighborhoods for weeks before each disappearance. The pattern suggested an offender who invested substantial time and effort in studying his victims, learning their schedules and vulnerabilities before striking. This level of planning indicated someone with significant resources, mobility, and patience, characteristics that made him particularly dangerous but also potentially traceable through careful analysis of his methodical approach. As news of the breakthrough spread through the community, residents experienced a complex mixture of emotions ranging from renewed hope to increased fear. The possibility that Claudia had been victimized by a serial predator was terrifying, but it also provided the first credible explanation for her disappearance that didn't rely on speculation about her personal relationships or voluntary departure. The community that had been divided over questions about Claudia's character and worthiness found new unity in the face of an external threat that could have targeted any of them. The investigation that had once seemed hopelessly stalled suddenly had new energy and direction, with resources pouring in from federal agencies and a sense among investigators that they were finally pursuing a viable path toward answers. Detective Morrison found herself working 18-hour days, coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies, analyzing evidence with advanced forensic techniques, and following leads that spanned multiple states. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that Claudia Lawrence's case might actually be solved, that the mystery that had consumed her professional life and haunted an entire community might finally yield its secrets to persistent investigation and scientific advancement. The investigation that had consumed Detective Morrison and haunted a community for over 3 years suddenly accelerated when advanced forensic analysis and interagency cooperation produced the first concrete suspect in Claudia Lawrence's disappearance. The breakthrough came when DNA evidence from her case matched genetic material found at 2 other crime scenes in the linked investigation, providing forensic confirmation that the same individual had been present at multiple locations where women had vanished. This connection gave investigators their first real opportunity to develop a comprehensive profile of the person responsible for what was now confirmed to be a series of carefully planned abductions. The DNA match led federal investigators to Carl Hendricks, a 42-year-old maintenance contractor who had been working for various educational institutions across the region during the time frame when all 5 women had disappeared. Hendricks operated a small business that provided cleaning and repair services to colleges and universities, a profession that gave him legitimate access to campus environments and detailed knowledge of security procedures, staff schedules, and facility layouts. His work history revealed that he had been employed at or near each institution where a victim had worked, providing him with opportunities to observe potential targets and plan his attacks. Hendricks had maintained a carefully constructed facade of normalcy that allowed him to operate undetected for years, presenting himself to clients and colleagues as a reliable, hard-working contractor who took pride in his profession. He lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of a rural community, maintaining minimal social connections and avoiding the kind of close relationships that might expose his criminal activities. His neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable, someone who kept to himself but was always polite and professional when interaction was necessary. The investigation into Hendricks revealed a troubling pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that had begun years before his first suspected victim disappeared. He had been arrested twice for trespassing on college campuses after hours, incidents that had been dismissed as harmless curiosity rather than reconnaissance for future crimes. More significantly, several women who had encountered him during his legitimate work had reported feeling uncomfortable with his behavior, describing excessive interest in their personal schedules and living situations that went beyond professional necessity. When federal agents obtained search warrants for Hendricks' home and business premises, they discovered evidence that provided chilling confirmation of his involvement in multiple disappearances. His house contained detailed surveillance photographs of all 5 victims, taken over periods of weeks or months before their disappearances. The images showed the women going about their daily routines, unaware that they were being stalked by someone who was methodically planning their abduction. The photographs were organized in elaborate filing systems that revealed the obsessive nature of Hendricks's preparation and his twisted psychological relationship with his victims. The search also uncovered maps, schedules, and handwritten notes that documented each victim's movements, work patterns, and vulnerabilities. Hendricks had maintained detailed records of their social connections, living situations, and security measures, information that allowed him to identify optimal times and locations for abduction. His files included backup plans for different scenarios, escape routes from each crime scene, and contingency procedures for avoiding detection, evidence of a sophisticated criminal operation that had been refined and improved over years of practice. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of personal items belonging to each victim, trophies that Hendricks had kept as souvenirs of his crimes. Among these items were pieces of jewelry, clothing, and personal effects that families had reported missing, along with their loved ones. The discovery of Claudia's favorite necklace, a simple silver chain that her father had given her for her 30th birthday, provided definitive proof of Hendricks' involvement in her disappearance and brought Peter Lawrence face to face with the first tangible evidence of his daughter's fate in over 3 years. The forensic evidence against Hendricks was overwhelming, But the man himself proved to be a challenging suspect who seemed to understand legal procedures and investigative techniques better than most criminals. During his initial interrogation, he invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney, demonstrating a level of legal awareness that suggested he had been preparing for eventual capture. His calm demeanor and lack of visible emotion when confronted with evidence of his crimes unsettled experienced investigators who were accustomed to extracting confessions through psychological pressure. Hendrix's attorney, Patricia Valdez, faced the difficult challenge of defending a client whose guilt was supported by extensive physical evidence and forensic connections to multiple crime scenes. Valdez focused her defense strategy on challenging the admissibility of evidence obtained through search warrants, questioning the reliability of DNA analysis techniques, and arguing that the connections between different cases were based on coincidence rather than proof of her client's guilt. Her approach reflected the reality that Hendrix was unlikely to avoid conviction, but that procedural challenges might result in reduced charges or sentencing. The arrest of Hendrix brought a measure of closure to Peter Lawrence and the other families whose loved ones had been victimized, but it also raised new questions about what had happened to the missing women and whether any of them might still be alive. Hendrix refused to cooperate with investigators or provide information about the location of his victims, leaving families in the agonizing position of knowing who was responsible for their losses while still not knowing the fate of their missing relatives. The possibility that some victims might be held captive somewhere created urgency around the investigation that had been absent when the cases were treated as isolated disappearances. Federal agents expanded their search efforts to include properties associated with Hendrix throughout the region, examining rental properties, storage facilities, and remote locations where he might have disposed of evidence or concealed victims. The searchers employed ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and other specialized techniques designed to locate human remains, but weeks of intensive effort failed to produce definitive results. The investigation revealed that Hendrix had been exceptionally careful about avoiding evidence that could lead investigators to crime scenes or burial sites. The community that had been divided over questions about Claudia's character and the investigation's progress found new unity in their shared outrage over Hendrix's crimes and their determination to support the families who had been victimized. The revelation that Claudia had been targeted by a serial predator rather than someone she knew personally eliminated many of the moral judgments and conspiracy theories that had complicated the case for years. Residents who had grown weary of the ongoing investigation renewed their commitment to helping find answers, organizing fundraising efforts to support the families and volunteering for expanded search operations. As Hendrix awaited trial, the investigation continued with renewed intensity, as federal agents and local investigators worked to build the strongest possible case while searching for additional evidence that might reveal the fate of the missing women. The arrest had answered the crucial question of who was responsible for Claudia Lawrence's disappearance, but it had not yet provided the closure that her father and the community desperately needed. The next phase of the investigation would focus on extracting information from an uncooperative suspect while building a legal case strong enough to ensure that justice would be served for all of his victims. The trial of Carl Hendrix began on a cold February morning, 4 years after Claudia Lawrence's disappearance, drawing intense media attention and bringing together families from multiple states who had been forever changed by his crimes. The federal courthouse was packed with victims' relatives, law enforcement officials, journalists, and community members who had followed the case through its long journey from missing person investigation to serial crime prosecution. Peter Lawrence sat in the front row, his weathered hands clutching a photograph of Claudia that he had carried with him to every court proceeding, his eyes never leaving the defendant who had destroyed so many lives through his calculated acts of violence. Prosecutor Amanda Torres opened the government's case with a methodical presentation of the evidence that connected Hendricks to 5 disappearances across 3 states, beginning with the forensic connections that had first linked the cases and building toward the overwhelming physical evidence that had been discovered during the investigation. Torres was known for her expertise in serial crime prosecutions, and she approached Hendricks' case with a combination of scientific precision and emotional appeal that was designed to leave no doubt about his guilt while honoring the memory of his victims. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence that definitively placed Hendricks at multiple crime scenes. Genetic material that defense attorney Patricia Valdez was unable to challenge effectively despite her attempts to question laboratory procedures and chain of custody protocols. The DNA evidence was supported by extensive documentation of Hendricks's movements during the relevant time periods, cell phone records that placed him in the vicinity of each disappearance, and financial records showing suspicious purchases of equipment that could have been used to commit the crimes. Perhaps the most compelling evidence presented by the prosecution was the collection of surveillance photographs and detailed victim files that had been discovered in Hendricks' home. Evidence that revealed the obsessive nature of his preparation and the calculating manner in which he had selected and stalked his targets. The photographs showed each victim going about their normal routines, completely unaware that they were being watched by someone who was planning their abduction. The jury was visibly disturbed by images of Claudia Lawrence walking to her car after work, shopping for groceries, and sitting alone in a restaurant, all captured by someone who was studying her vulnerabilities. The prosecution also presented testimony from witnesses who had encountered Hendricks during his legitimate work at various educational institutions. Individuals who described his excessive interest in female employees' schedules and personal lives. Several women testified about feeling uncomfortable with Hendricks's behavior, recounting instances where he had asked inappropriate questions about their living situations, work schedules, and social activities. While these encounters had seemed merely awkward at the time, they took on sinister significance when viewed as part of a systematic pattern of victim selection and surveillance. Defense attorney Valdez faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming evidence, focusing her strategy on challenging the connections between different cases and arguing that her client was being prosecuted for crimes he had not committed. Valdez suggested that the investigation had been compromised by confirmation bias, with investigators so eager to solve multiple cases that they had ignored evidence that might have pointed toward other suspects. She also attempted to portray Hendricks as a man whose eccentric behavior and social awkwardness had made him a convenient scapegoat for law enforcement agencies under pressure to solve high-profile disappearances. The defense's case was severely undermined by Hendricks' own demeanor during the trial, as his complete lack of emotion when confronted with evidence of his victim's suffering created a disturbing impression that even the most sympathetic jurors found difficult to ignore. When shown photographs of the missing women or testimony from their grieving families, Hendricks displayed no visible reaction, staring straight ahead with an expression of cold indifference that suggested either guilt or profound psychological dysfunction. His refusal to testify in his own defense eliminated any opportunity for the jury to hear an alternative explanation for the evidence against him. The trial's most emotional moments came when family members of the victims testified about the impact of their loved ones' disappearances, providing the jury with a human face for crimes that might otherwise have seemed like abstract legal proceedings. Peter Lawrence's testimony was particularly powerful as he described the 3-year nightmare of not knowing what had happened to his daughter and the devastating effect of learning that she had been stalked and targeted by a predator. His voice broke as he spoke about Claudia's dreams and aspirations, the future that had been stolen from her by someone who viewed her as nothing more than an object to be collected. The prosecution's presentation of Hendricks' victim files revealed the disturbing extent of his obsession with the women he had targeted, including detailed notes about their daily routines, personal relationships, and perceived vulnerabilities. The files contained maps of their neighborhoods, photographs of their homes and workplaces, and schedules that tracked their movements over periods of weeks or months. Most chilling were Hendricks' handwritten assessments of each victim's suitability based on factors such as their living situations, social connections, and likelihood of being quickly missed if they disappeared. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Hendricks, testified about his psychological profile and the characteristics that had enabled him to operate as a serial predator for years without detection. Mitchell described Hendricks as a highly organized offender who derived satisfaction from the planning and control aspects of his crimes rather than from impulsive violence. His ability to maintain a normal facade while conducting elaborate surveillance operations demonstrated sophisticated psychological compartmentalization that was consistent with the most dangerous types of serial criminals. The trial also revealed the extent to which Hendricks had exploited his legitimate access to educational institutions to identify and study potential victims. His maintenance contractor business had provided him with opportunities to observe campus security procedures, access employee records, and develop relationships with staff members who unknowingly provided him with information about potential targets. The abuse of this professional access added an additional layer of violation to his crimes, as he had perverted relationships of trust and service to facilitate acts of violence. As the prosecution presented evidence from each connected case, a pattern emerged that showed Hendricks' methods becoming more sophisticated and his crimes more brazen over time. His first suspected victim had been taken from a well-lit parking lot near a busy street, while later disappearances occurred from increasingly isolated locations where the risk of discovery was minimal. This escalation suggested that Hendricks had been refining his techniques based on experience, becoming more confident in his ability to avoid detection and more willing to take risks in pursuit of his victims. The defense's closing argument focused on the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence against Hendricks, arguing that forensic connections between cases did not prove that their client was responsible for all of the disappearances. Valdez suggested that the real perpetrator might still be free, while an innocent man faced life in prison based on coincidental evidence and investigative tunnel vision. However, her arguments were undermined by the sheer volume of evidence connecting Hendricks to the crimes and the absence of any credible alternative explanation for his possession of victim belongings and surveillance materials. Prosecutor Torres concluded the government's case with a passionate appeal for justice, reminding the jury that 5 families had been devastated by Hendricks' crimes and that countless other potential victims had been spared by his arrest. She emphasized that the evidence against Hendricks was not circumstantial but overwhelming, including DNA matches, physical evidence, and documentation of his systematic stalking behavior. Torres argued that the defendant's refusal to cooperate with investigators or show any remorse for his actions demonstrated his continued dangerousness and the necessity of removing him from society permanently. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including 5 charges of kidnapping and multiple federal crimes related to interstate transportation and weapons violations. As the verdicts were read, several family members wept with relief, while others maintained stoic composure, their emotions complicated by the knowledge that conviction would not bring back their missing loved ones or answer all the questions that remained about their fates. Judge Robert Harrison sentenced Hendricks to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims. In pronouncing the sentence, Harrison described Hendricks' crimes as among the most calculated and cruel he had encountered in 30 years on the bench, noting that the defendant's systematic approach to victim selection and his complete lack of remorse demonstrated irreparable psychological dysfunction that posed a permanent threat to public safety. Despite the successful prosecution and lengthy sentence, the trial's conclusion left many questions unanswered, as Hendricks had never revealed the location of his victims' remains or provided information that might bring closure to their families. The conviction represented justice served but not healing achieved, as the families continued to live with uncertainty about their loved ones' final moments and the location of their resting places. The case that had begun with Claudia Lawrence's mysterious disappearance had ended with legal resolution, but not complete emotional closure for those whose lives had been forever changed by one man's capacity for calculated evil. 5 years after Claudia Lawrence first vanished from her quiet college town, her father, Peter Lawrence, stood before her memorial stone in the community cemetery, a permanent marker that honored her life while acknowledging the tragic reality that her body had never been found. The conviction of Carl Hendricks had provided legal closure and confirmed that Claudia had been the victim of a serial predator rather than someone who had voluntarily disappeared. But fundamental questions about her final hours and resting place remained as mysterious as ever. The case that had captivated a community and challenged investigators across multiple states had reached its legal conclusion while leaving profound emotional wounds that might never fully heal. The years following Hendricks' conviction had been marked by continued efforts to locate the remains of his victims, searches that employed increasingly sophisticated technology and consumed significant resources without producing definitive results. Federal investigators had examined dozens of properties associated with Hendricks, conducting extensive excavations and employing ground-penetrating radar to scan remote locations where he might have disposed of evidence. Each search raised hopes among the victims' families that their loved ones might finally be brought home. But repeated disappointments had gradually eroded optimism and forced families to confront the possibility that some mysteries might never be solved. Peter Lawrence had aged dramatically during the 5 years since his daughter's disappearance, his hair now completely grey and his face marked by lines that reflected years of worry, grief, and frustrated determination. Despite his advancing years and declining health, he continued to advocate for continued searches and maintained pressure on law enforcement agencies to pursue every possible lead. His dedication to finding Claudia had become both an inspiration to other families facing similar tragedies and a source of concern for friends who worried that his obsession with answers was consuming what remained of his life. The conviction of Hendricks had brought Peter a measure of peace by confirming that his daughter had not chosen to abandon her family or disappear voluntarily, but it had also introduced new sources of anguish as he struggled to imagine what her final hours might have been like. The evidence presented at trial had revealed the extent of Hendricks' surveillance and planning, forcing Peter to confront the reality that Claudia had been stalked for weeks or months before her abduction. The knowledge that she had been living under threat without knowing it added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating loss. Detective Morrison, now nearing retirement after a distinguished career in law enforcement, continued to receive occasional tips and leads related to Claudia's case, though none had produced significant breakthroughs. The detective had developed a personal relationship with Peter Lawrence that extended beyond professional obligation, visiting him regularly to discuss new developments and providing emotional support during particularly difficult periods. Morrison's dedication to the case had earned her recognition within law enforcement circles, but she privately considered her inability to locate Claudia's remains one of the most significant failures of her career. The community that had been transformed by Claudia's disappearance had gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though the case remained a permanent part of local memory and identity. The annual memorial service in Claudia's honor had become an established tradition that drew hundreds of participants, including many who had never known her personally but felt connected to her story through years of media coverage and community involvement. The scholarship established in her name continued to help students pursuing culinary careers, creating a positive legacy that honored her professional passion and dedication to serving others. The university where Claudia had worked had implemented new security procedures and employee safety protocols that were directly inspired by lessons learned from her case, changes that potentially protected other staff members from similar threats. The dining hall, where she had spent her final shift, now displayed a memorial plaque that celebrated her service and commitment to the university community, ensuring that future generations of students and staff would remember her contribution to campus life. These institutional changes represented concrete steps toward preventing similar tragedies while honoring Claudia's memory in meaningful ways. The broader impact of Claudia's case extended far beyond her immediate community, as her story had become part of national conversations about missing persons investigations, campus safety, and the resources devoted to solving cold cases. The successful prosecution of Hendricks had demonstrated the value of interagency cooperation and advanced forensic techniques, leading to policy changes that improved communication between law enforcement agencies and standardized procedures for handling complex, multi-jurisdictional cases. These systemic improvements represented a positive outcome that emerged from tragedy, potentially preventing other families from enduring similar ordeals. The media attention that had initially helped generate leads and maintain public interest in Claudia's case had gradually diminished as other stories captured national attention, but her disappearance continued to be featured in true crime documentaries and missing persons databases that kept her story alive for new audiences. The documentary that had aired during the second anniversary of her disappearance continued to generate occasional tips and renewed interest from amateur investigators who analyzed the case using online forums and social media platforms. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic psychologist who had testified at Hendricks' trial, had continued studying his case as part of her research into serial predator behavior, hoping to identify warning signs and patterns that might help prevent future crimes. Her work had contributed to training programs for law enforcement officers and campus security personnel, educating them about the sophisticated surveillance techniques employed by organized offenders like Hendricks. The psychological profile developed during the investigation had become a valuable tool for identifying similar threats and understanding the mindset of predators who target specific victim populations. The families of Hendricks' other victims had formed an informal support network that provided emotional assistance and shared resources for continued search efforts, recognizing that their shared tragedy created bonds that extended beyond geographical boundaries. This network had become a source of strength for Peter Lawrence during his darkest moments, connecting him with others who understood the unique challenges of living with unresolved loss and the complex emotions that accompanied both legal justice and continued uncertainty about their loved ones' fates. As the 5th anniversary of Claudia's disappearance approached, Peter Lawrence faced the sobering reality that he might never learn what happened to his daughter in her final hours or be able to lay her to rest in a known location. The legal system had provided justice through Hendricks' conviction, but the deeper human need for complete answers and physical closure remained unfulfilled. Peter's friends and family encouraged him to find peace in knowing that Claudia's killer had been identified and would never harm anyone else. But the father's heart continued to yearn for the opportunity to bring his daughter home and say a proper goodbye. The case that had begun with a simple question, "Where is Claudia Lawrence?" had evolved into a complex exploration of human evil, community resilience, and the limits of justice in providing complete healing for those who have suffered unimaginable loss. While legal proceedings had concluded and the perpetrator had been punished, the mystery of Claudia's final resting place ensured that her story would continue to haunt those who loved her and challenge those who sought to understand how someone could vanish so completely from a life that had seemed so grounded and secure. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Claudia Lawrence's story. We'll see you in the next video. Some mysteries are solved in courtrooms, while others remain buried in places only silence knows. Claudia Lawrence's case reminds us that justice and closure, though related, are not always the same, and that some questions echo longer than the voices that first asked them.